Today we begin looking at Chapter 3, which deals with the Constitution. So we want to begin with Chapter 3.1, a blueprint for government. Make sure that as we go through this lecture, that you write down in your notes anything that you see in red on the screen, and make sure you submit it for a grade. Feel free to pause the video at any moment to be able to catch up on what you need to catch up on. Now, as we begin to look at this topic of the blueprint for government, the outline for government, I want to bring up something that James Madison said in Federalist Paper number 51. Now, remember when they wrote the Constitution and sent it out to the states for ratification or formal approval, they had to, the James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote a series of essays, 85 in total, that were published in newspapers throughout the states that were meant to encourage people to support the ratification of the Constitution. And so in those 85 essays, they explained the various concepts that they had put forth in the Constitution and the thinking behind it and all of that. Well, in paper number 51, written by James Madison, most likely, he wrote this, and I thought it was really profound, and I want to start our lesson with this today. He says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. In other words, if people were angels, we would be perfect. We wouldn't have to have laws because we wouldn't do anything wrong. Okay, that makes sense. You wouldn't need a government. He said, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In other words, if angels were governing humans, then you wouldn't have to control them because they would not abuse their power and take away people's rights. Then he says, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable government to control the governed, and in the next instance, oblige it to control itself. So he said, here's the problem. The people being governed are not angels, and the people doing the governing are not angels either. So as we framed this Constitution to establish a new government, we had to give a government with enough power to control human beings who are not perfect, and yet also force that government to control itself so that it would not abuse its power because they also are human beings and they're not perfect. And I thought that was a good way to start out our lesson on this basic blueprint for government that they came up with. So let's begin with our notes. What are the 6 goals of the Constitution? Well, you'll recall that the Constitution begins with the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and it goes on and tells what it wants to do. Well, there are 6 basic goals established in that preamble. So let's look at each one of those. First one, form a more perfect union. In other words, they wanted to strengthen the relationship between the states, among the various states, so that they would work together in a more cooperative and better way than what they had done previously. They also wanted to figure out a way where this new national government would be able to work also with the states in a very cooperative way in what they called the federal system, where the national government has certain powers and the state governments have certain powers. So basically, they wanted to establish a system where the states could work together more cooperatively and where the states could work together with the national government in a cooperative way. The second goal, establish justice. They wanted to provide laws that are reasonable, that are fair, that are impartial, and make sure that the administration or the carrying out of those laws is also reasonable, fair, and impartial. We may doubt whether they do that, would have accomplished that, but that's the goal. The third one, ensure domestic tranquility. In other words, keep peace and maintain order within the country. Domestic means within the country. Tranquility is peace, okay? So they wanted to keep peace and maintain order within the country. In other words, if we can't control and maintain peace and order in our country, then people cannot be free to truly live out their pursuits and their liberties, okay? The fourth one, provide for the common defense. Not only do we need to keep peace and order within the country, they wanted to make sure that we could defend our country from foreign enemies as well and keep peace for the people and protect them from foreign enemies. Number 5, promote the general welfare. This is basically the concept that allows all states and citizens to benefit from what the government could do, both militarily and economically. Okay? In other words, every state and all people should have the benefits of what government can provide as far as protecting and tranquility and peace and things like that. And the 6th one, secure the blessings of liberty. They wanted to protect the liberties that we had fought the revolution for and preserve them for the generations to come. You know, they believed that the government in England was infringing upon the rights of the colonists. And so that's why they fought the American Revolution. So we gained these rights, or we fought hard to protect these rights. And so they wanted to establish a government that would make sure those rights are maintained, not only for their time, but for all ages to come. Okay, so those are the 6 goals of the Constitution. Feel free to pause if you need to and finish typing this out. Okay, now as we look in the Constitution, we find your textbook says 6 principles of government. I would disagree and say there are only 5, and we'll talk about why I say that in a minute, but I wanted to give you the 6th because that could come up on the test, and I want to make sure you know what the book says for that. Okay, so the first one we find is popular sovereignty. Well, in order to understand that, you need to understand what those terms mean. Popular means of the people. Sovereignty means rule or authority or power. So basically, this is the idea that the power rests with the people. And that's what your definition says. The concept that the government gets authority from the people. And ultimately, political power remains with the people. This goes back to that concept that the founding fathers relied upon, that they got from political philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and some of them that believed in what was called the social contract, where they believed that in order to secure certain measures of peace and security, they came together and formed a government and authorized that government in a social contract to protect their rights and their liberties. Okay, and so they believed that the government's power rested with the people, that authority rested with the people, and that was a break from tradition. Historically speaking, up until that time, most everybody believed that the power of the government came from God. You know, we had the divine right of kings is what the Europeans believed. In China, they called it the mandate of heaven. But it's this idea that heaven or God or the gods, whatever you believed in, gave the authority to the rulers, and the authorities could do whatever they wanted to because their authority comes from God, not from the people. America broke away from that idea. Authority and power rests with the people. Okay, so we believe in this concept of popular sovereignty. The people ultimately have the power and the political authority. The second one is limited government. It's the principle that the powers and functions of the government are restricted by the Constitution as well as other laws to protect individual rights. We have rights that the government is there to protect. They do not grant us our rights, but they cannot take away those rights legally speaking. Okay, and so things like freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, those kinds of things are rights that are guaranteed to us by God, and the government is restrained by the Constitution from infringing upon those rights. That's the concept of limited government. Okay, the government itself is limited. It does not have unrestrained power. The third one is this idea of separation of power, that in order to prevent a government that would be so strong that it could do whatever it wanted to do, they divided up the power of the government into 3 separate branches: executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch. This was a new concept in the world when this was done. But basically, you have separate branches that are equal in power, and they share power. Some of those powers overlap. Sometimes they have to work together or whatever. But this power is divided among these executive, legislative, and judicial branches to prevent concentration and abuse of power by any one branch. So it's this idea that we could keep the government from being so strong by dividing its power amongst several branches of government. The fourth principle is this idea of checks and balances, that each branch of government has the authority to check or restrain some powers of the other 2 branches. So for instance, the legislative branch, which is Congress, makes the laws, but in order for those laws to go into effect, the executive branch, the president, has to sign it, or they can veto it. If the president vetoes the law, the Congress can override that veto. The president is the chief, commander-in-chief of the military, and so he can do things with the military that he doesn't have to ask permission for. But the military is funded by Congress, so that's a check and a balance over those branches of government. Okay, and so not only do they separate powers out, they also have ways to restrain the powers of the other branches. The fifth one is judicial review, and this is the one that I would disagree with the book about. This is not in the Constitution. We do not see the concept of judicial review written in the Constitution at all. The framers of the Constitution debated on whether they should put it in the Constitution or not, because some states had that power and some did not. And so it did not get in because they couldn't agree on the issue. So technically, that is not a principle of government in the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803 instituted the principle of judicial review, where the judges and the courts can decide whether an act or a law is invalid or not constitutional. And that has been a principle ever since then, but it is not a principle that we find in the Constitution. It was instituted years later, okay? And then the last one, federalism. The rights of the states are protected by dividing powers between the national government and the state governments. In other words, the national government has certain powers and authorities. The state government has certain powers and authority, and some of those overlap, like they both can collect taxes, but only state governments can run the education system. That's a state power. Only the national government can coin money. That's a national power. Those kinds of things. All right, so make sure that you submit this when you finish typing it out. And if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. Have a good day.